Minister, I want to raise with you this morning the ongoing unacceptable situation in relation to people in mortgage arrears and the scale of the crisis that continues and the essentially hands-off approach of the government and indeed the central bank to the resolution of the issues facing thousands and thousands of families whose entire future is in jeopardy and whose lives are essentially paralysed by the lack of sustainable solutions being brought forward. Since central bank targets have come into play, about 13,000 letters have issued and have been sent out by the AIB, by Bank of Ireland and indeed Ulster Bank, initiating the potentially devastating prospect of eviction and repossession. And that figure, interestingly, Minister, dwarfs all other potential solutions, such as loan extensions, such as interest-only deals or split mortgages. Ulster Bank yesterday were before the committees, acknowledging that over 4,000 owner-occupiers are now in the legal process, and admitting frankly that up to 1,500 have a realistic chance of being repossessed. And the Taoiseach had said in the House here over some months ago that was the last resort and something the government didn't want to countenance. And the inconsistency of the approach is unacceptable, Minister, and depending on who you have the loan with is very much the issue for those who borrowed. So, for example, if you take the split mortgage approach, depending on whether you borrowed 200,000 from AIB or Bank of Ireland or permanent TSB, you have a dramatically different approach from the different banks and outcome for the individual lender. So a person, if he's with the AIB, could be up to 57,000, could be better off on the same mortgage of 200,000 than with Bank of Ireland. I mean, it's an extraordinary difference. And I don't think it's acceptable that a customer has to depend on pot luck, depending basically whether it's Bank of Ireland, whether it's permanent TSB, whether it's AIB. And that determines a massive difference in terms of how that one option plays out. So, Minister, what I want to put to you, 18 months on after the personal insolvency regime was introduced and all the targets that have been set by the central bank, the situation is not satisfactory by any stretch of the imagination and is not sustainable for many families. And it's time, really, for a fundamental review of how this issue has been approached and for a far more hands-on approach from government and indeed the central bank to bring a more standardised and consistent approach to the mortgage arrears issue.
Thank you. Minister.
I'd like to thank the Deputy for his question. There's no doubt at all that one of the harshest and direst consequences of the economic collapse from 2008 to 2011 was the indebtedness of large numbers of our fellow citizens, and particularly the indebtedness of couples who can't afford to pay their mortgages. And the government has addressed this with very strong assistance of the central bank. I think there has been agreement across the House on the approach where the central bank set targets on a quarterly basis to resolve the issue of impaired mortgages, and these targets being met. In round terms, sustainable solutions have now been put in place for 54,000 households who have mortgage arrears that they cannot cope with. Now, that's significant progress. Now, I would hope the progress would continue, and that's why I'm so pleased that the Finance Committee has called in all the main lenders this week and is putting them through their paces. And they had Ulster Bank in yesterday, PTSB are in this morning. I understand PTSB say they have offered 60% of their mortgage holders new arrangements now. So they seem to be leading in exceeding targets. But it's very important that the targets are met, and we will continue to drive the targets. And I know the committee will pressurise the lending institutions to ensure that they keep to these targets. There's another side to the indebtedness as well, of course, and it's the buy-to-let sector. Now, they have made significant progress in the buy-to-let sector as well. Bank of Ireland claim that they have offered solutions to 90% of their buy-to-let customers, and AIB claim that they have offered solutions to 65% of their buy-to-let customers. But it is one of the big problems which is impinging on the personal lives of couples, many of them young couples, and it's a very difficult situation. And it's a drag and an inhibition on the economy as well, because people who are coping with so much personal debt, they're not fully participating in the economy. And we have to continue to drive it forward. There's a range of solutions. It's not potluck. The central bank has set down a protocol and have set the targets, and they have agreed the range of solutions that are acceptable. So there's a standardization of approach across the banks, but of course within the range of options available to the lenders, one bank goes stronger in one direction than another. So there are variations, but there are variations within an agreed scheme. And I acknowledge the seriousness of the situation, but steady progress is now being made, and with everybody's help, we'll continue to drive it forward.
Thank you.
So the variation is stark in terms of the split mortgage, for example. It's as wide as 57,000. Couldn't be acceptable. That depending on who you bank with, or who you took the mortgage up with, you can be better off by 57,000 in the application of a single option in a split mortgage. So that can't be acceptable. And it shouldn't be reduced to just how lucky you are to happen to have a split mortgage with the IB as opposed to Bank of Ireland or opposed to Irish Permanent. The personal insolvency regime minister, the Minister of Justice, did say he'd review it after 18 months. I think we've only had 4 cases. It's had a negligible impact on the mortgage arrears crisis. And the central bank targets seem to have led really to an attack on the mortgage owner as opposed to the mortgage crisis itself. So it has led to a ramping up of legal actions, up to 13,000 legal letters sent out. And the mere sending out of those has a terrible impact on families and on people who receive them.
Thank you.
And I think that needs to be reviewed. And when you talked about a cross-party consensus on this, I mean, our own colleague, Deputy Michael McGrath, yesterday made the point at the committee that it is very worrying that 30% of Ulster Bank's customers who are in arrears of over 90 days are now in the legal and repossession area. And Deputy Kieran Lynch, who chairs the Finance Committee, made the point that Ulster Bank, he says, and I quote, are very, very opposed to any debt removal that is based on people remaining in their home. So the central objective of government, as articulated in this House, which was to protect people in their family homes, is falling apart at the seams, I would suggest. And that there's a very determined focus now by the banks in response to the targets to start a significant process of repossession. And the first bank that came before the committees yesterday said that up to 1,500 family homes could be repossessed. And that was a realistic prospect for those 1,500 families. So, Minister, isn't it time for a more fundamental review of how government and the central bank have approached this issue, with a view to putting the protection of the family home as the #1 priority in resolving and responding to the undoubted difficulties that people are facing?
Thank you.
It's the clear objective of the government that persons in mortgage distress should continue to live in the family home, and that solutions other than repossession would be the solutions that would apply from the range of solutions that are available. It's also true to say that unless repossession is part of the legal system, there'll be no mortgage market, because nobody will lend unless there's a legal potential to realise the collateral. So, you know, it's part of the legal system. Now, the government's relationship with different banks is different. Ulster Bank that you mentioned, while it's regulated by the central bank, we don't have any shareholding in it. On the other hand, we have 99% of the shares in AIB and 14% of the shares in Bank of Ireland. Now, I read what the Chief Executive of Ulster Bank said in this morning's newspapers at committee yesterday, and it wasn't as blunt as you have represented it. What he said was that the purpose of legal letters to many of their customers was to get them to engage, because unless they engage, they can't bring forward solutions. And the purpose of it was not to proceed to repossession, but to get to engage in a process where the letters they had written previously were being ignored by customers. Now, the people who are at the committee, well, I'm simply telling you what was reported, and I assume it was an accurate report of proceedings at committee yesterday. So you should, no, Deputy.
Sorry, Deputy.
No, Deputy,
We're over
You know,
time.
when you're quoting people, you should quote them in context, and you should give the full quotation. You know, selective quotation to make some kind of political point isn't helpful. But you know, it is the government's policy that people will continue to live in their family homes, that solutions other than repossession would be put in place. It's also our policy that the lending institutions who have entered into agreements with the central bank will keep those agreements and meet their targets. To date, they're doing so, and 54,000 permanent solutions have been offered. And we will continue to drive that agenda forward. And I'm absolutely delighted that the Finance Committee this week is scrutinising the progress being made by the lending institutions, and, you know, without being anyway harsh on the lending institutions, I'm glad that the members of the committee are putting some pressure on them so that they will continue to meet their targets.
Thank you.